Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, Emotion, Reason, and the Human Brain, this book, I don't know if you've seen it, was an attempt to refute Descartes. And it's an interesting book. I recommend the first chapter, which is on a very famous story by someone named Phineas Gage, who was a perfectly functional human being until he was in a freak accident and a metal bar was went through his head, and he actually survived, but he appeared to lack certain emotional qualities, even though he retained intellectual function and bodily function, but he started making very poor decisions and descended into alcoholism. And so it's a very interesting, and Damasio's argument is to make the case that body and brain are one, and that because he had this particular spike through this particular area of his brain, that he lost particular sorts of functions. So it's an interesting book, but the problem is that it's kind of wrong about Descartes. It relies on an older vision of Descartes, which a lot of people have been confronting. So it used to be that Descartes was really associated with what we call dualism. That is, that the mind and body were completely separate entities. And I think because a lot of people read mostly his meditations, and early in his career, Descartes did seem to think something like that. But what you read for this week is a book called The Passions of the Soul, which really kind of makes us rethink what we know about Descartes. And scholars are starting to rediscover this book called Passions of the Soul, and have really concluded that that you get a very different image of Descartes. So for Descartes, emotions are bodily perceptions, and so emotions tie the mind and the body together, or as Descartes would say, the soul. And the soul is only accessible through these passions. So emotions are mingled with thoughts and perceptions in Descartes, and emotions actually cause physical changes in the body. And he spends a lot of time discussing those physical changes. And sometimes it seems a little strange from a modern perspective to go into all these great detail about how your body changes when you have particular emotions. But clearly in Descartes, mind and body and soul are deeply interdependent and working together. Emotions are always caused by some kind of outside stimulation, and it's actually the emotions that unite the body and the soul. So this book was written later in Descartes' career, which actually wasn't that long because he died fairly young. But it was written at the request of Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who he became friends with. And he was actually invited to her court to be a resident philosopher. And she admired him very much, and they started this correspondence. And his letters have since been published, but she declined to publish her letters. And they were only rediscovered in the 1870s. And so some scholars have started to look at those letters too, to kind of see that we might think about the Passion of the Soul as emerging out of a dialogue between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth. And the reason why that's been important is because Descartes has really been pilloried by feminists, although very interestingly, in the last 10 years or so, he's kind of been rediscovered by feminists, and a case has been made that you can have a Cartesian kind of feminism. And that's will be interesting to us, because there's a bigger picture about how Descartes, an older view of Descartes is that we're all isolated from each other because we're isolated from our bodies. Brain and body are separate, and that makes us isolated from each other. But emerging reading of Descartes that pay attention to his writings on emotion actually show that the opposite is true, and that there's much in Descartes about the ethics of how people treat each other. In order to understand why feminists have traditionally been skeptical of Descartes, if not like actually, vehemently rejected Descartes, you have to understand a little bit about the dualism with which he was once associated. So the idea of dualism comes, I think, in part out of a Christian tradition in which the mind is superior to the body, and the body is something that's despised, and the body is a temporary house for the soul, which will go on to other things after the body disintegrates. So the body is a trap, it's an encasement. So things that have to do with the body are degraded and less important than things have to do with the mind or the soul. So somehow you have an essence in this Christian tradition that transcends your body. So certain pleasures of the body have been considered by some to be inferior to pleasures of the mind or pleasures of the soul. And so I'm going to focus on just one feminist in particular, who actually is somebody I admire, named Susan Bordeaux. And she argued that Cartesian dualism leads to hypermasculinization. And that's because the ego is radically alienated from the body, from the world, and from other people. And that has become the foundation for Western thought. Actually, the nefarious foundation for Western thought and Western culture. And it all goes back to Cartesian dualism. And she argues that Cartesian dualism, you can think of it as a masculinist absolute detachment. But in the last maybe 10 years, few years or so, there's been a change in thinking about Descartes, and partly because people have been reading this book that you read that's called The Passions of the Soul, which offers a larger and richer perspective on Descartes. And also the letters between him and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia actually show a more complicated and richer vein of thought. So I'm going to start with a well-known feminist theorist philosopher named Luce Irigaray, and she's a Lacanian. She's written a lot. She's actually somebody who I studied in graduate school, and she's still out there writing, and also somebody who is commenting on her, named Rebecca Wilkinson. And both of them, and Wilkinson has sort of brought attention to Irigaray's thoughts about Descartes. But of course, as a psychoanalyst, or someone invested in psychoanalysis, Irigaray really was drawn to the way Descartes talks about the fetus and the mother. And her argument is that it's not just a matter of like a little cargo inside a ship, but that there's a profound sympathetic relationship between these two beings. And that's actually, just sort of parenthetically, that is actually has a huge influence in the 18th century, maybe not particularly coming from Descartes, but that was definitely a profound belief that, and actually maybe it was fading in the 18th century, but whatever a woman saw or felt or experienced would somehow be transferred to the fetus. And so the fetus was not just a biological entity, it was also an emotional entity. And Descartes also argues that the fetus feels joy in the womb. And so that's the beginning of emotion, because, and also love. And love is the sense of you being a part of a larger whole, which is why a fetus would feel love and would feel joy at that love, because they're nestled into another person. And so Irigaray really liked that. And And that's, of course, not really dualism anymore. And commentators Rebecca Wilkinson also point out that a central value in Descartes is wonder. And so, just kind of going back to the fetus and the origin of how humans feel things, the initial human impulse is wonder. And it doesn't exactly mean like sort of what we are thinking it means now, but it's really kind of wonder. Wonder is surprise at the extraordinary, and so that's how it's defined in Descartes: is surprise at the extraordinary. So a child experiences a lot of wonder because everything's extraordinary because they haven't seen things before. But of course, adults can experience wonder too. And Irigaray argues that in Descartes, wonder is value neutral, which is what's so great about it, in the sense that your prejudices have not yet kicked in. And so you initially experience a new thing just with the emotion of wonder. And then there's some sort of cognitive sorting of that image that follows. He doesn't really say it that way, but I think that's how we would think about it. And so the second kind of foundation of emotion of humans as emotional beings in Descartes, according to Irigaray, and I think these two things, wonder and generosity, are a pretty good reading of Descartes. So one is wonder and the other is generosity. And so generosity depends on how you are going to greet this other object that you come across for the first time. And Descartes says you're going to experience it in two ways, and you'll see the style of thinking in Hobbes too. You're going to greet it with either disdain or with a kind of with respect. So respect or disdain are your two possible reactions. And so that's why generosity is the thing that leads to the respect part. And we want to avoid disdain. So in Descartes, all passions are based on wonder, because all passions have to do with something outside of the body impinging on the body, and how the body responds to those things is determines the emotion. And then the emotion is, of course, worked out in the pineal gland in your brain, and then it gets dispersed back out to the body, so you can see emotions on the body. Interestingly, I've heard arguments that this model had a profound effect on the theater of the time, because it was argued that before Descartes, actors were believed to be compelling because they were passionate human beings, and so it was fascinating to watch them. But that also, that's why that they were kind of disparaged and stigmatized. But after Descartes' reassessment of emotion, actors, you can now see, would be people who would be the most in control of their emotions, because they have to manifest these emotions bodily, and that they're not necessarily feeling them, but they're controlling them, and they're controlling their bodies as well. So that allowed actors to become more socially acceptable and even admired, and eventually, quite lionized, because this control of emotion was came to be considered an art. So for Descartes, when we confront a new object, we're transfixed on it immediately without judgment. And so he argues that it's good to be born with a capacity for wonder. And even if we're not born with one, we could cultivate a capacity for wonder. So he thinks that's an advantage. Although he does argue also that you should be careful about having an excess of wonder, and that's another danger that Descartes mentions, that too much wonder could be overwhelming and we're not really functional. What Irigaray argues is that if you start with wonder, you can actually have imagine a non-hierarchical model of sexual difference, which is mostly what she's interested in. So if your model is simply, your initial impulse is just to be transfixed in wonder by something that's not like yourself. And there's a gap between that and the immediacy of judgment. And that it leads to the possibility of non-hierarchy in general, as other critics have kind of jumped in. Particularly, I'm relying on somebody named Marguerite Lacaze, and or I'm not really sure. It's yeah, I'll spell it above. But so she argues that Descartes' sense of wonder can lead to moral humility. She actually sees like a kind of problem with this model that is being raised by Wilkinson and Irigaray. And as much as she is very invested in this idea of wonder and generosity as fascinating proposals by Descartes, she argues that, quote, one cannot be both prior to judgment and involve an attraction to and a response to the other. So she argues that it's not possible to actually have that moment of suspension of judgment, that the judgment is always there no matter what. So those are two ways of thinking about Descartes, but Descartes does think that you can suspend the judgment, and that's what other feminist philosophers have been recently attracted to him for. And so once you have this experience of wonder, you either go, as he puts it, esteem or disdain. Those are the two options. So that's where your judgment. And then once you have that, that will be followed by either generosity or pride. So clearly, if you disdain something, that is going to lead to your own pride. And if you esteem something, then you can process it through a framework of generosity, which doesn't really mean the same thing as it does in English. So I'm trying to explain it so you can't really think of it as the English word of like giving charity or something. It's not about that. So Descartes argues that the key to the good life is to cultivate generosity, which is, as Lacaze argues, a species of wonder combined with love, which involves having proper pride or rightful self-regard. So she argues in her interpretation of Descartes is that you are only able to enact this generosity upon wonder if you have regard for yourself. And regard for yourself comes from knowledge of your own virtue. Don't have that regard for yourself, you will probably go down the other road of disdain. So she argues that generosity gives us the basis for general respect, and wonder gives us the basis for an acceptance of the limitations and ethics of the limitations of ethical generalizations. So we need both wonder and generosity. So while Descartes has always been accused of having disdain for the body and arguing that for a mind distinct from the body, I think we can see now that he does not argue for a transcendence of bodily induced passions. And without the body, there are no passions, because passions come into the body through external stimulation. And whether it's a visual experience or something you hear or something you touch or something you experience, that your mind has no access to those experiences without a body. So this brings me to another emotion in Descartes, which is hate. So why do we need hate? We mostly think of hate as a bad thing. And for Descartes, clearly love is better than hate. I mean, love is the thing you feel in the womb. It's I can actually see why Irigaray, who's a psychoanalytic critic, is attracted to Descartes, because it sort of strikes me as what Freud calls the oceanic feeling, where you stand before an ocean and you feel like you're just part of the universe and your identity is completely erased because you're part of a larger whole. And that's kind of the pinnacle of human happiness in, I think, in Freud, and in I think in Edmund Burke too. It's also experience of the sublime. But in psychoanalysis, it has to do with the fetus's original connection with the mother's body. So it's because of passions. It's only because of passion that the soul, now bear with me, I'm in Descartes language, that the soul wants to stay connected to the body. So otherwise the soul would just fly away. But the soul needs passions, and or desires the experience of passion, or is programmed to embrace passion. I'm not sure how I would quite put it in Descartes, but we would have no passion if we didn't have a body. And so hate has this kind of function in that it protects us. It actually distances us from threats to the body. So as much as, and this goes back to the thing about having too much passion that I mentioned before. So all these stimuli coming in, you can't always absorb all of them, and of course some of them are bad. Like you see a lion, you don't want it to eat you, so you have to have some sort of. It's not like your mother when you're in the womb; it's the opposite. So you need to have something that pushes away outside forces that could hurt you, particularly that could hurt your body. So hate is a way to protect your body. So we are integrated beings with mind, body, and soul, but at the same time, there is some separateness, and the individual soul needs to protect the body from threats. And that's possibly where the idea of also Descartes, the idea that Descartes has been accused of as thinking of humans as having as not being connected to each other, because the connection is the ideal, the love and joy are the connection, but hate is necessary because of these threats to the body. And so it forces you, hate will prompt you to withdraw from a harmful relationship, and when they provoke too much passionate intensity. So if you get too much passion, and remember this is a physical response, like you see the lion and your heart races and your blood surges and you start sweating, and your body's like, oh my God, that's way too much passion, I'm getting out of here. And so that actually lets you protect your body. Again, like Descartes has been accused of being the foundation of Western individualism, but as I'm describing, a lot of recent philosophers are, just kind of saying, well, it's not quite that. And maybe a better term is individuation, because you are at the same time different from things outside of you. You're not the same as the lion. You're not a fetus in the lion's womb, unless you are a little cub. So he does argue that we survive only if we love, but to be embodied is to be dangerously exposed to others, for better or worse. So because we have bodies, we're always in danger, and we're not complete ethereal beings like angels, mythically angels, who don't really have bodies, or it's not clear, reading Milton, whether there's like actually a body there or not. But because we are there is still kind of a sense of a mind encased in a body rather than a total integration of these things, but it's the soul that mediates, and the soul experiences these passions, and the passions bring you great happiness, and they also protect you from dangers when you get these physical reactions to things, which is actually one like little thing I'll just add in our discussion of the passion of the soul, which is to notice how much of a materialist Descartes is. And that kind of means that yes, he talks about a soul, and there's a kind of possibly somewhat mystical aspect, but so much of what he writes about and what you read is about just the existence, our existence as material bodies in material space. And that's what is significant about humans and what needs to be studied about humans. So it's very materially focused. And what I mean by that is materialist in the philosophical sense, like Lucretian materialism. And this emerged as sort of what I think they would call deism in the 17th and 18th century, in which, yeah, there's a God out there and he kind of gets the ball rolling, but everything else in the universe is filled with material objects crashing into each other that are not guided by a divine force. They're just themselves. So finally, I'm going to turn to Aristotle, and what you read is from a larger work called The Art of Rhetoric. And so Aristotle in this work didn't really necessarily set out to describe emotions, but he's interested in how, as a speaker, you can persuade other people. And so he talks about what the emotions look like if you want to give examples in your speech, or if you're writing a play and creating characters, they have to be consistent with what our human emotions are like. And so what we get is actually like an incredibly fascinating and insightful account of human beings. And so I'm not gonna say a lot about Aristotle, but I do want you to notice that the biggest difference in my view between Aristotle and Descartes is that Aristotle sees emotions in a political context and in a hierarchical context. So indignation, for example, which is not really emotion that Descartes talks about. Indignation is, a good example of a kind of emotion that Aristotle talks about, because indignation comes about when somebody you consider beneath you, gets something that you don't think they should have, or that you think you should have. Although you don't even need to think that you should have it to have indignation. You just don't like the fact that they have it. Really, so indignation itself thus depends on humans being in a hierarchy, because indignation doesn't really occur between equals. It occurs when you see somebody who you consider below you getting something that you don't think they deserve. Envy, on the other hand, can kind of only take place between equals. So if there's somebody, way below you and they get an extra bowl of gruel for their breakfast, you don't actually envy that, because you're not essentially you're not competing with them. And then if like a king gets a new diamond in his crown, you don't really envy that, because you're not really competing with kings, and you're not a king, and who really cares? So envy only occurs as like, yeah, my neighbor got a new car. Maybe I could get a new car. I can't afford a new car. It's a nice car. That's really envy, because it's somebody who you think is on the same plane as you. So this is not really what we see in Descartes. So I think one of the reasons why we're starting with Descartes and Aristotle is because they present two interesting and different models for thinking about emotions. And I'll just say in general that in this course, I'm really not making any assumptions that there's a transhistorical idea of emotions. In fact, I would insist on the opposite, that everything takes place in history. And in fact, there's a burgeoning new-ish field called the history of emotion. And people who work in that field argue that the emotions felt in the 17th century are not the same that we feel now, or they're somewhat different. So, for example, there was an interesting book about French painting. How at a certain point, before this date, nobody smiled in paintings, and then after this date, lots of people smiled in paintings, or it's assumed that you smiled in paintings. And so, it's kind of an example of a history of emotion. The way this has affected the 18th century is there's been a lot of interest in, and we'll be talking about this later, in the emergence of what's usually called sentimentalism in the 18th century, and we'll get more specific about that later. But that this is kind of seen as a new emotional regime. The term emotional regime comes from William Reddy, who's a historian of emotion. And so part of understanding the past, he argues, is understanding a different emotional network and assumption, or what he calls different emotional regimes in which people are born into and learn emotions. So in this sense, emotions aren't abstract things that come out of just being a human and having a human body, but they are enmeshed with history. So one thing along those lines that I'm interested in, that we'll talk about later in the course, is there are certain works of art in the 18th century, and in our course, plays or poems or novels that were incredibly popular at the time, and then we read them now and we're like, what? What, who cares? Or so instead of just saying, boy, they were idiots with bad taste, I'm really interested in, like, why were people so fascinated by, well, a play we're going to read next week called The Indian Emperor? Why were they weeping over it? Why were people so emotionally attached to certain things that seem not worthy to us of being attached to? And so I want us to kind of think back without judgment and not really assume, be Cartesian in this respect, is experience wonder and withhold judgment, and think about why people embrace this, even if it's not speaking to you. What is it what can we reconstruct that it could have spoken to someone else? And that's the first step to understanding that your self is not the model of all humanity.